we're taking you on a detailed walking tour through New York's Lower Manhattan with a comprehensive look at Soho, Greenwich Village, Chelsea, the High Line, Chinatown, Lower East Side and the East Village, streets from 14th up to 34th, and the Financial District at Wall Street, the World Trade, and the Oculus Center. 3 of New York's best neighborhoods for walking are Soho, Greenwich Village, and Chelsea. And in this segment, we're going to take you on a stroll through the area, starting out with several minutes wandering through Soho, which is the neighborhood south of Houston Street. And it had been a rundown industrial neighborhood with factories, warehouses, and truck loading ramps, but in the last 40 years, it became New York's supreme cutting-edge artistic neighborhood. Soho got more and more popular as lots of artists moved in, attracted originally by cheap rents in illegal lofts. Some excellent streets to meander include Spring, Prince, Broome, West Broadway, and Mercer. The map gives you a rough idea of where we're going. Walk a couple of blocks along Green Street to find the thickest concentration of galleries, cafes, and hip shops, and the largest collection of cast iron facades. Designer shops, pricey art galleries, fancy fashion emporiums have definitely moved in and taken over, and yet there are still many clever small shops here that appeal to the discriminating tastes of hip clientele, or for cheaper bargains, sidewalk stands and sometimes parking lot flea markets sell all kinds of useful junk. Here and there, streets are still paved in the original Belgian cobblestones, imparting a strong European feeling to the neighborhood. Soho is very distinct with these cast iron facades. It has the largest collection of cast iron buildings in America, constructed mostly in the last half of the 19th century. From the late 1960s, art galleries came in, and then restaurants and trendy shops followed. Prices skyrocketed to a point where only the wealthiest dot-commers can live there now. The artists have been squeezed out and relocated to Brooklyn, Jersey, the East Village, and Lower East Side, but with a similar sequence of changes now happening there too, in that never-ending process of gentrification. Big money has taken over most parts of the city. If only you had the foresight and the money to purchase some property here back 40 years ago, you would be a zillionaire today. The most famous Soho food shop is the original Dean and DeLuca on Broadway at Prince Street, which is gourmet heaven. They started out as a small sandwich bar and grew into the city's trendiest food market, but you can still get sandwiches, coffee, and snacks to nibble on. It's busy all day and lively right into the evening. They have expanded now with some branches outside of New York, but this is the original location. From Dean and DeLuca, we walk north to the Village along Broadway. Across Houston Street, it just takes a few minutes, passing more interesting blocks of the city with coffee shops and little markets, which soon brings us to the NYU student section. Since the 1830s, New York University has had a campus here, which grew much larger in 1973 when their Bronx campus was relocated. And now NYU owns large sections of the area and most of the buildings around Washington Square Park. NYU is the largest private college in the country and one of the best. So we'll go through Washington Square Park, down McDougall, over to Bleecker Street, and into the West Village, where we'll spend most of our program, especially walking along Bleecker Street. You can walk almost anywhere, any which way you want in the village and have a great time, but we're going to show you a suggested route that hits a lot of the highlights. Relatively quiet neighborhood, but in Manhattan, the possibility of action is always waiting right around the corner, with that blend of exciting high energy and peaceful little shops, cafes, and streets. The central gathering place of the village is Washington Square Park, a leafy green space with benches, fountains, many people going by, and sometimes some wonderful musical entertainment. The village has always been a hotbed of jazz, and that tradition continues with musicians in the streets and in the parks. And Watch this passerby turn his coffee cup into a bongo drum and play along. Notable performers in the jazz clubs here included Pearl Bailey, Count Basie, Nat King Cole, John Coltrane, Miles Davis, Ella Fitzgerald, Coleman Hawkins, Billie Holiday, Leadbelly, Charlie Parker, Dinah Washington, and the folk scene with the Weavers and especially Bob Dylan. The white marble Washington Arch dominates the park, 86 feet high with a span 30 feet wide, designed by Stanford White. It was completed in 1895 and commemorates the first inauguration of George Washington, namesake of the park. Photographed in early June, you can see how pleasant the weather can be and great to be sitting outdoors on the benches. But here's how it can look in the winter, on a snowy day in February. In the 18th century, this was a cemetery for poor people. 20,000 of them are still underground here. There are lots of squirrels in the park, and typical of city squirrels, they're used to people. These guys are pretty friendly. Maybe they were extra hungry because the snow was covering their usual feasting grounds. So these young gals were feeding them 3 at a time. Looking towards Washington Square North, just beyond the arch, you'll see a stately row of brick townhomes. These have been here since the 1830s. Like most of the buildings around Washington Square Park, they're now owned and occupied by NYU. On the map, you can see how many buildings NYU has all around Washington Square Park. Enough space to take care of its 26,000 undergraduates. We're going to walk out the southwest corner of the park onto McDougall Street, one of the great spots in the village. It was the epicenter of bohemian life throughout most of the 20th century, with jazz singers and poets and writers such as Bob Dylan, James Baldwin, Jackson Pollock, Ernest Hemingway, Eugene O'Neill, a host of famous writers, painters, and beatniks. It's still considered a colorful and magnetic venue, a great place to stroll and maybe get an exotic bite to eat. In spite of the gentrification of most of the village, McDougall Street still seems like a working-class neighborhood. The cuisines of the world are on display here, ranging from Ethiopian, Egyptian, Italian, falafels, French crepes, and of course there's always pizza. This one block between West 3rd and Bleecker is among the best that New York has to offer. And then it gets even better as you take a turn on Bleecker Street, which is the longest interesting street in the village. It even has a couple of tiny parks with fountains. As you stroll along Bleecker, you'll be tempted by the side streets as well. It's a terrific place to meander. The streets here are well adapted to the mood of the random rambler, for they lead everywhere and nowhere and just wind about in the most irregular ways. The route does get pretty twisted, which is a big part of the charm of this area, so you could just play it by ear and improvise to pick your walking route. However, the streets can be confusing to navigate. You don't have to have a plan, but it can help to use a map to ensure you don't get too lost and miss out on some worthwhile streets. Our route so far to Bleecker, and then we'll continue on down to Hudson Street, kind of the western limits of the village. Hudson is a broad commercial street with a nice neighborhood feeling of shops and restaurants and apartments. From there we swing back into the main part of the village along a street named Grove. And along Grove we see a place called Grove Court with attractive old houses built around a courtyard. Grove is another one of those fascinating streets with a mix of commercial and residential. It would be a great place to live if you could afford it. Crossing Bleecker Street and continuing along into a very intricate part of the street network of Greenwich Village. It has to be the most complicated intersection in Manhattan. We take a look at 8th Street, you might try 10th Street, and then double back along Christopher Street, which is another one of those don't miss it places worth your time for a walk along. It's a place that became an international symbol of gay liberation. Returning to Bleecker, the village is one of America's most expensive neighborhoods, costing over $2 million for the average 1,000 square foot apartment. residents of the village still possess a strong community identity and are proud of their neighborhood's unique history and fame, and its well-known liberal live and let live attitudes. The village is a world unto itself. It's a little escape from the action of Midtown Manhattan that shouldn't be missed. Residents and preservation groups have been concerned about developments in the village and have fought to preserve its architectural and historic integrity. More than 50 blocks of the village is part of a historic district. Redevelopment in that area is severely restricted, and developers must preserve the main facade and aesthetics of the building during renovation. We're going to take a walk in Chelsea, one of the nicest neighborhoods of Manhattan. It's primarily a residential place for local people rather than for tourists, which makes it all that much more attractive for the inquisitive visitor to go explore. You'll find a mix of quiet side streets and busy retail avenues. Chelsea's located between 14th Street and 34th Street, between the Hudson River and about 6th Avenue. It's just about 1 mile south of Times Square, which puts it pretty close to Midtown, and yet it is a world apart. Its main characteristic are the many streets of residential row houses, a very exclusive enclave. 20 years ago, there was nothing particularly exciting about the neighborhood. It was always a nice residential zone. But in recent decades, things have gotten a lot more interesting with the introduction of hundreds of art galleries and the High Line, an elevated park along what had been a railroad viaduct. The High Line has become one of the most popular attractions in New York City. It's amazing. Originally, it was planned as a neighborhood park because Chelsea doesn't have much in the way of parks, and now it attracts visitors from all over the world, and New Yorkers love it as well. We'll take you on a walk from start to finish later in the program, 1.5 miles from the Whitney Museum up to Hudson Yards. First, let's walk along a little bit more in these quiet side streets and the busy commercial avenues. You'll find the bicycle rental stands all over Manhattan, and they're popular here in Chelsea, with some lanes devoted to bicycles. 8th Avenue is one of the main commercial and retail thoroughfares here. It's almost like the village center, with a nice variety of shops, mostly independent, and some chain stores are found here. Restaurants and delis with a variety of foods in a nice price range that caters to all income levels. Because while this is an expensive neighborhood with mostly high-end residences and tourists always coming through looking for bargains, there are also many long-term residents, some of them living in rent-controlled and rent-subsidized apartments. People generally seem to be happy and friendly around here. They're in a good mood. They're very grateful to be living in such an excellent neighborhood, no doubt. There's something quite stimulating about being surrounded by such interesting range of commercial activities, and especially when you can retreat to your quiet, tree-lined residential street in your comfortable row house. There's a calm feeling here of a stable neighborhood. Taking the dog for a walk in a place like this often leads to friendly interactions with your neighbors, conversations with strangers even. It helps tie the block together. This friendly, casual feeling really gets a chance to breathe and express itself with all of these outdoor restaurants. It's almost like being at a party where everybody is welcome to join in. A local recommended Don Giovanni Ristorante, which turned out to have some excellent foods. Their website says, "We have proudly watched our neighborhood develop around us, from a barren area to a now thriving scene." They're in business for 20 years on 10th Avenue at 22nd Street. We've been focusing here on the central part of Chelsea, between 8th Avenue and 10th Avenue, and from 19th Street up to about 22nd Street. There's a lot more to the neighborhood, of course, but this central area is a good place to explore if you have somewhat limited time. This neighborhood would also be a good place for a visitor to stay for a few days. There are some small hotels and over 300 Airbnbs available. Don't wait too long because this is a neighborhood in transition. There's some construction going on. There's some conversion of buildings to condominiums. For example, this General Theological Seminary of the Episcopal Church had to convert one of their buildings to luxury condominiums to rescue their financial plan. It's the oldest Episcopal seminary in the country, with the first buildings constructed in 1836. One of the neighborhood's favorite restaurants is the Red Cat, but you better make a reservation if you hope to get space in this popular place. Of course, there are dozens of restaurants that reflect the ethnic diversity of the area's population, which is also noted for its social diversity and inclusion with its large gay population, along with those multimillionaire bankers in their posh apartments, and Latinos and recent immigrants, casual burger joints with beer on tap, and the action goes well into the evening. The art gallery scene has been thriving for a decade, ever since rents in Soho and the Village skyrocketed. Artists and their dealers have settled in. Check the newspaper for schedule of art openings. You'll find that time passes very quickly when you're wandering around in Chelsea, because there's just one block after another with endlessly fascinating things to see. Night has fallen before we even got to the High Line. The elevated park has good lighting and you can walk it at night, but we'll save it for the daytime. We'll take you back the next day and walk that High Line from one end to the other. Starting at the south end near the Whitney Museum below 14th Street and continuing north 23 blocks to 34th Street and the Hudson Yard terminus. At the south end on Gansevoort Street, you clearly see the elevated structure beginning, where a gentle staircase leads you up into another world, an elevated park that lets you glide over the city. Looking down at it from the Whitney Museum, you can see how it goes underneath the first high-rise building. That's the Standard Hotel, constructed over the High Line. Continuing under another building, the former Nabisco factory, now converted into the Chelsea Food Market. Futuristic buildings such as Barry Diller's headquarters, designed by Frank Gehry, contrasts with the older side of Chelsea, such as looking back at this Episcopal seminary we saw earlier in our walking tour at street level. There are some vantage points where you can look back at the elevated structure itself. Next to this automobile elevator storage system, looking back, you can clearly see the massive steel viaduct. It was for freight trains that delivered cargo to the warehouses and factories of this once heavily industrialized neighborhood of the West Side. This is one of the 10 staircases that provide entrance to the High Line, and half of those have elevator access for wheelchairs and strollers. These entrances provide a physical and symbolic transition from the urban to the rural. Up here, you feel like you're out in a country meadow. It's magical to be walking through a garden and yet with city views, such as looking towards the Chelsea piers along the Hudson River. People watching is always part of the fun, like viewing a piece of theater starring a diverse range of players in a drama. The park attracts the full range of age, ethnic, and income, enjoyed by all. There are many places to sit down and relax, ranging from benches to multi-level terrace steps or just sit on the grass. You're welcome to bring your own food and sit down and have a picnic, and there's also food available for sale in some parts in most of the year. It's open year-round with plants and landscaping designed to show the entire cycle of the year. In the winter it's brown and flowers in spring and summer, and then fall colors. While it might look natural, it was all carefully planned, especially under the guidance of the Dutch garden designer Piet Oudolf. This part was photographed during May, and coming up soon you'll see the brown vegetation of a February winter. With staircase entrances about every 3 blocks, it's possible to just walk along a short section of the High Line, if that's all you've got time for. Or, as we're doing, walk the entire 1.5-mile length. You'll find that's quite rewarding. Creation and maintenance of this park involved a lot of effort by many people, starting with Robert Hammond and Joshua David, who were the co-founders of the movement to save the High Line. In 1999, they created Friends of the High Line, an organization that is still responsible for operating and maintaining, and they have an excellent website. 2 other important players were Barry Diller and his wife Diane von Furstenberg, who were the first financial backers and drummed up public support with eventually 10,000 people contributing. Then Mayor Bloomberg was also instrumental in getting the political machinery to make it happen. We've already arrived at the end of the line at Hudson Yards, where a massive new development is going to build 18 high-rises and create a new city in town. The High Line is credited with stimulating similar urban revitalizations throughout its entire length. Fortunately, this subway station opened in 2015, and it's great because you can get from the end of the High Line right to Times Square non-stop in a few minutes on this new line that was created at a cost of over $2 billion. This makes it quite easy for you to walk the entire length of the High Line and get back to your hotel quickly. You'll find the High Line is one of New York's most magical experiences. A soothing contrast to the hustle and bustle and to the exciting and yet chaotic energy of Midtown Manhattan. For a longer movie about the High Line, I recommend the High Line movie on the Great Museum's website, narrated by Susan Sarandon. You'll really enjoy it. We're going to take you on a walk in Lower Manhattan through the districts of the Lower East Side, the East Village, and Chinatown. You'll find authentic life in the streets down here, a little bit more gritty than the glitz of Midtown. The adventure awaits for you, slightly off the beaten track. There are 11 Chinatowns in the New York area with about 800,000 total residents, comprising the largest Chinese population outside of Asia. We're taking you to Manhattan's Chinatown, which is the most famous, and while it's not the biggest, it's home to the highest concentrated population density of Chinese people in the Western Hemisphere. Tourism, manufacturing, and retail are the major industries, with 300 Chinese restaurants, some Asian antique shops, and countless souvenir stores sprawling over many blocks. Located in Lower Manhattan in the blocks around Canal Street, as you see on the map, this is one of America's oldest Chinatowns. The first Chinese arrived in the 1840s, and they have been coming in ever since. However, there were restrictions put on immigration in the late 19th century. In the years after 1965, when America allowed many more immigrants from Asia into the country, the population of Chinatown increased dramatically, and now the sidewalks are often crowded with a mix of locals and tourists. Most visitors blow through in about half an hour and just walk along a couple of the main streets like Mott and Mulberry and Canal and then depart, and that's fine. But you can venture into the side streets and go further east to get a real taste of the neighborhood, as we're showing you on the map route that we took to make this movie, bringing you all around. Chinatown has several quite different faces. On one hand, it's an exotic bit of Asia appealing to tourists. It's like entering a different world from the rest of Manhattan. Lots of shops selling trinkets and many restaurants serving authentic cuisine, making a fine place to stroll. On the other hand, it's a very busy commercial district with small factories, trucks loading and unloading everywhere, warehouses packed with goods, importing, exporting, many little banks, and a slightly chaotic energy. It's a busy New York dynamo. And it is also home to 100,000 Chinese, many of them poor, living in cramped housing, unable to speak English, and hardly, if ever, leaving this neighborhood. The housing stock of Chinatown is still mostly composed of cramped tenement buildings, some of which are over 100 years old. And yet the public face of Chinatown is that of a touristic destination. Souvenirs that are real expensive elsewhere in the city are more affordable here, and it's the same item you'll find in Midtown. After all, most souvenirs and these cheap t-shirts are made in China, so it figures there is a direct pipeline to Chinatown merchants. There are many dozens of these tourist shops, and they usually have pretty much the same stuff. You can play the bargaining game here, especially if you're looking at several items. So here's a couple of tips. Ask them, what's your best price for this and that and that? and then show no interest and walk away, and maybe you'll get a better offer. Turn around and make your counter, and then pull out some cash. It's good to have a lot of 10s and 20s so that you can negotiate in the lower end. Show them the money and make a deal. That's all standard practice down here in Chinatown. It's part of the fun and will save you a little money. These merchants will never be offended by your low offers. Columbus Park, the only park in Chinatown, is a popular gathering spot for young and old. Card playing, checkers, gossip, soccer, basketball, relaxing. It's a major recreation center and makes a good place to get away from what might be small apartments. Considering the astronomical price of Manhattan real estate, it's remarkable to have this open space, and yet necessary for the 100,000 residents. The park is located on what had been during the 19th century the most dangerous ghetto area of immigrant New York. This was the famous Five Points neighborhood as portrayed in the book and film Gangs of New York. Now on one side it's bordered by a tall building housing the criminal courts. Chinatown first got started right here on Mott, Moscow, Pell, and Bleecker Street, as you can see on the map, and we are going to take a little walk around the block here. Pell Street is one of those earliest locations of Chinatown, and it's a few blocks south of Canal, away from Mulberry, so there's not many tourists here. It's mostly local, and plenty of local shops and bars and retail stores and Chinese signs everywhere. Bleecker Street is only 1 block long, and yet it seems to go on forever with that bend of the road. It's got a history from the Tong Gang, who had some violent shootouts with rivals here. Conditions have changed considerably since then in Chinatown, especially with the more recent gentrification. Rent is going up. Apartment prices are skyrocketing. Super expensive housing is spreading down from Soho. Chinatown is expanding north into what had been Little Italy and out to the East River. There's not much left of Little Italy anymore, only 2 blocks along Mulberry Street, most famous for Ferrara, that great bakery with their cannolis. This neighborhood used to be filled with thousands of Italian immigrants 100 years ago, and now the Italians and other non-Chinese groups are pretty much gone. Still has some Italian restaurants, but it's mostly tourist gift shops. It's very much a neighborhood in transition. A lot of construction going on, revitalization of the old buildings, and everything is going upscale, even down here in the Lower East Side. We'll take a walk along Hester Street for a few blocks. It's one tourist shop after another, it seems, but fun to look at with these open fronts. As you look down the side streets, you'll notice that gridiron of the old fire escapes. It really is a characteristic and quaint touch of old New York. Here you can see how Chinatown has really been expanding, especially out here on the east side with the residents from Fuzhou in the southeast part of China. In recent decades, they've been the main group coming in. Sarah Roosevelt Park, named after the mother of FDR, is a very popular gathering spot for the locals. This part of town has always been an important place of commerce since the beginnings of our nation. Cargo was unloaded at the docks 400 years ago, and this kind of work is still going on today in the streets, such as Allen Street, which is pretty much the eastern boundary of Chinatown, completing our look at this ethnic enclave. We're going to take you on a walking tour through New York's Lower East Side and the East Village, including a major dog park. It's a part of the city that most visitors don't get to, and yet you'll find it's one of the most interesting places in New York. On the map, we'll show you a good route heading from Astor Place down Lafayette Street, below Houston down to Hester, touching on Chinatown, then up to the East Village. In a separate movie, we'll take you to Soho and the West Village. Starting out at Astor Place, which is a lively intersection of multiple streets. And there's a subway entrance here. You'll see Cooper Union. That's one of the best small colleges in the country, especially for engineering, architecture, and the fine arts. And a little plaza with furniture. People can sit here and lounge, have a snack, watch the passing parade of students and workers go by. There are two major subway lines that cross through here that'll take you up Broadway or Lexington Avenue. And notice the old-fashioned style of that subway entrance. It's heavily influenced by a Parisian glass canopy style. Astor Place did not always have this open, spacious feeling. Back in the 1920s, there was an elevated train that ran through this same square, as happened on many of the avenues of New York in those days. Heading south into what's called NoHo, we'll be meandering along Lafayette and the Bowery and some of the side streets in between as we make our way down to Houston. We're heading for the Lower East Side and we'll circle back up into the East Village. But first, to look at this kind of industrial, semi-downbeat neighborhood called NoHo that's north of Houston. It's an in-between place that doesn't get a lot of attention, but that makes it fascinating to explore a little bit. So much of Lower Manhattan has been gentrified with new buildings going in and old buildings demolished. It's really quite delightful to see this more authentic presence in the city. 100 years ago, the Bowery was a place of poverty and squalor, but now it's looking good. This sharp angle at Bleecker, Mulberry, and Lafayette brings us to Houston Street and the flagship store in New York of REI, a great sporting goods shop. 2 levels and a large floor area have all sorts of clothing, shoes, hiking gear, hardware, and tents, everything you could need for the outdoor life. Continuing south of Houston on Lafayette Street, we are heading for Little Italy and then on into the Lower East Side. You'll come upon a French Baroque-style building with the dome that used to be the old police headquarters. Now it's an upscale condo. There's not much left of Little Italy anymore, only 2 blocks along Mulberry Street. Most famous for Ferrara, that great bakery with their cannolis. This neighborhood used to be filled with thousands of Italian immigrants 100 years ago. Now it's on the edge of Chinatown. Still has some Italian restaurants, but it's mostly tourist gift shops. It's very much a neighborhood in transition. A lot of construction going on, revitalization of the old buildings, and everything is going upscale, even down here in the Lower East Side. We'll take a walk along Hester Street for a few blocks. It's one tourist shop after another, it seems, but fun to look at with these open fronts. As you look down the side streets, you'll notice that gridiron of the old fire escapes. It really is a characteristic and quaint touch of old New York. Continuing now along Hester, passing a park and busy street, walking along Ludlow, Orchard and Stanton and Rivington, deeper into the Lower East Side. Here you can see how Chinatown has really been expanding, especially out here on the east side with the residents from Fuzhou in the southeast part of China. In recent decades, they've been the main group. Sarah Roosevelt Park, named after the mother of FDR, is a very popular gathering spot for the locals. Another popular place along Hester Street is the Meow Parlor. You've got to make a reservation here to play with the cats. These are frisky rescue kitties up for adoption and ready to play. The Lower East Side has always been an important place of commerce since the beginnings of our nation. Cargo was unloaded at the docks 400 years ago, and this kind of work is still going on today in the streets, such as Allen Street. Hardworking people unloading wholesale goods ready for redistribution throughout the city and the country. It's curious that this Allen Street 100 years ago used to be very narrow and dark and had an overhead train running through it. It was like a black canyon, but later it got widened, they got rid of the elevated train, and now it's a busy street all the way north to where it becomes First Avenue. It has become a true boulevard with a wide median with chairs and tables for people to have lunch and bicycle lanes and pedestrian thoroughfare, with restaurants such as Dirt Candy, a fine vegetarian place. Well, now we are taking you further north, really into the heart of what is the Lower East Side today, away from Chinatown and Little Italy and the busy streets, into some wonderful places for strolling. We'll take you on a walk north on Ludlow and along Orchard Street. This has become one of my favorite parts of the city. Notice how the buildings are original. There are no skyscrapers here, not much modernization going on. It feels like New York back in the 1950s, but it's the Lower East Side, a place that 100 years ago was packed with the most crowded population in the country. Dirt poor, but with a vibrant street life that must have been exciting. Now there are galleries and upscale living, making it a wonderful place, but some of the old charm is gone. There's no more street markets. Even on Orchard Street, that had been famous for its weekend street markets, dwindled to practically nothing. Orchard is still fun, lined with some of the old-time shops like this luggage store that had a tremendous variety for us. We bought 2 bags. How long's your store been here?
35 years.
35 years. You have a lot of luggage. These blocks around the north end of Orchard Street have an authentic urban charm with a lot of character. You don't see many chain stores here. They're individual, idiosyncratic. They've got grocery delivery on electric mopeds, for example. There's a real feeling of neighborhood here. You'll probably run into some street performers, maybe even a 10-year-old electric guitar rocker. An artistic edge with a bohemian atmosphere. Back in the mid-20th century, it was a popular and cheap place for beatnik poets and radical artists, along with ordinary poor people. While back in the 19th century, it was the center of immigrant life with millions of Irish and Jews and Germans coming through, along with Italians and lots of East Europeans. This was the first melting pot in America, the launching pad for our growing country. Now it's one of the most hip and desirable neighborhoods in the city, and it's still somewhat affordable. We've traveled north of Houston Street, which means we have arrived in the East Village, walking north a few blocks along First Avenue and then meandering down 7th Street and St. Mark's Place, ending up at Tompkins Square Park. We're also near the edge of Alphabet City, which has a lot of middle-class housing developments along Avenues A, B, and C. You've got health food shops and a cluster of Indian restaurants as we make our way north, and now walking along East 7th Street, one of the main routes through the East Village. Until about 1960, there was no East Village. It was all considered part of the Lower East Side. But then, as the hippies and beatniks and artists started moving into this area, it took on an identity of its own. Since many were refugees from rising prices in Greenwich Village, they dubbed it the East Village. Tompkins Square Park is an eclectic centerpiece for this neighborhood, and it's quite large, occupying several city blocks. It's been a park since the mid-19th century, a great place for recreation and political protest. It's had its ups and downs. In the 1980s, it was really at a low point, a haven for the homeless and drug addicts and crime. But that changed in the 90s. They fixed it up, and it's very popular and safe today for the families. It features the usual park attractions and something very special. This place has gone to the dogs. Yes, it features the largest and oldest dog run park in the city. Opened in 1990 and recently renovated and expanded. You can see this is an extremely popular spot. Even for a visitor without a dog, it's a great place to stop and watch the fun for a while. While the park is owned by the city and supervised overall by the Parks Department, the dog run is managed and funded by the community. They set up a foundation called Friends of First Run, and they've secured funding for renovations and ongoing maintenance. These pampered pooches are very well taken care of. And there's a lot of friendly cooperation here. Great place to socialize for humans and dogs. You are familiar with the famous neighborhoods of New York like Times Square and Chinatown and Wall Street in Lower Manhattan. Then there's Greenwich Village, Washington Square, Central Park. But there is another big fascinating chunk of Manhattan that a lot of visitors don't see, between 34th Street and 14th Street. And we're going to show you the highlights in this movie. In many ways, it's the authentic commercial heart of the city. Just a mile from bottom to top, but we'll take a winding route 3 times longer. So today we're going to take a little walk around Manhattan. We're going to zigzag back and forth, kind of off the beaten track, have a look at the real New York that tourists don't generally pay a lot of attention to. We'll start at Union Square and walk you north to 34th Street, giving you a taste of the real life of New York City. This quick summary reveals the contrasts of this Midtown South. Coffee shops to relax, some famous landmarks, busy shopping streets, Koreatown, Asian imports. There are some characters on the street that you'll meet. Hotel prices are a bit lower here. At the end, we'll have an extended sequence on rush hour at Penn Station, 34th Street. But we start out in a much more quiet zone. George Washington presides over Union Square in the spot where he met the public after the British evacuation in 1783. The farmers market happens all day, year-round, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and Saturday, from about 8 in the morning until 6 p.m. You can see it's a big hit with the local residents. This park has been here for 200 years, originally called Union Place, the name deriving from the connection of a union of streets, Broadway and 4th Avenue. In that early 19th century, it was quite a rural place with a truck farm nearby. But by the 1870s, this neighborhood became the center of good living with theaters, hotels, and fine restaurants, reflecting the exuberance and energy of the growing city. But by 1900, the fashionable part of the city was moving northward, leaving Union Square as a low-rent, cheap manufacturing area, especially for the garment industry. In recent decades, Union Square has been rejuvenated and has really become one of the most desirable neighborhoods in the city for residences, restaurants, a place to work, and shopping. Notice across the street Paragon Sporting Goods. This is typical of the kind of big shop that you've got in this area, loaded with hard-to-find specialty items. From Union Square, we'll take a little walk up to Gramercy Park and continue up to the Flatiron District and Madison Square Park. Wander a few blocks east as far as 2nd Avenue, which is becoming a booming new residential district. And you will reach Stuyvesant Square, a quiet park that was originally part of the farm of Peter Stuyvesant, the last Dutch governor back in the late 17th century. Now it's a pleasant 4-acre neighborhood park bisected by 2nd Avenue. Continue 4 blocks north towards Gramercy Park, you will pass Pete's Tavern, a famous restaurant and bar. Gramercy Park has a big fence around it because it's private, only for the use of those residents of the neighborhood, a very exclusive enclave of old money. Also on the square, you'll find the National Arts Club in a distinctive building. It's open to the public. There's a small art gallery, and you can visit several of the rooms. The mission of this private club is to stimulate and educate the public in the fine arts. The mansion was originally the home of Samuel J. Tilden, who ran for president after Ulysses Grant and won the popular vote, but lost in the Electoral College. Walking along 21st and 22nd Streets, we'll be heading north another block to the Flatiron District and Madison Square Park. Flatiron is a sharp-angled triangular building at the scissor-like intersection of Broadway and 5th Avenue, facing Madison Square Park, which was named after President Madison. The restaurant chain Shake Shack started here, and because of its gourmet, affordable hamburgers, has expanded to nearly 150 locations. Eataly is another astonishing food success. Founded in Italy in 2007 as a kind of food megastore, it has rapidly been expanding, combining elements of a high-end food court, a European street market, and an American supermarket. The obelisk monument in the park is a memorial to General William Jenkins Worth, hero of the Mexican War. This 6-acre park was opened in the mid-19th century, and aristocratic mansions were built all around it. It later became an entertainment and office district, and it is still a thriving area. Looking up Fifth Avenue provides some nice views of the Empire State Building. The popular City Bike program has one of its 700 station racks here, and we had a chance to see them manipulating. They have to relocate the bikes to even out the distribution and availability. Now we're going to walk a while along the streets and avenues of the mid-20s in this lower Midtown section. Sometimes called Midtown South, it's an area that a lot of tourists never get to, but it's fascinating. There's a raw mix of downbeat and upscale here, all mixed together. There are 10 million stories in the city, and this is one of them, from the bubble salesman who was having difficulty getting a permit, losing some money that he's been trying to get back.
So these lawyers got on the case, right? There's a gang of them down there. They do these cases, right? They get back millions and millions of dollars, and you know they make tons of money. Yeah, he said, don't worry, we're gonna get that. We're gonna get you that money back. But they overcharged me.
Oh, got it.
It was $1,000.
Can I record this?
Yeah. I'm gonna get it. I'm gonna get it. See what I'm saying? They sell better in the sun.
This bubble guy is gonna get his money. These few blocks north of Madison Square Park are sometimes called Nomad, north of Madison. It's one of those pockets of the city that just do not have a clearly defined name or label to it. It overlaps with the Garment District, with Koreatown. In mid-20th century, this was quite an industrial area, a lot of manufacturing going on, especially of clothing. And now it's becoming a lot more retail and residential, with discount clothing stores along 6th Avenue. Continuing north along 6th Avenue a few blocks up to 32nd Street, which is a great example of a fascinating neighborhood that most tourists never get to because it's just a bit south of what is normally considered Midtown Manhattan. 34th Street is often the lower boundary for many visitors, where you've got Macy's and Herald Square, as we'll show you in a moment. But just a couple blocks south of there, you get this busy commercial street that's loaded with all kinds of Asian goods. It's Koreatown, which also spills north a few blocks above 34th Street, with lots of hard-working Korean merchants. And of course a lot more, with a big cosmopolitan mix in this heart of the city. This brings up an interesting question. What do we call this part of Manhattan? It's not only Koreans, it's not really Midtown, which is more like starting about 34th Street and on up to 59th Street at Central Park. It's not Lower Manhattan, because that's below 14th Street. It's kind of an ill-defined area, but the emerging consensus seems to be, let's call it Midtown South. Realtors and commercial brokers like that name because it gives it a certain pizzazz, and this is definitely an up-and-coming neighborhood. The whole stretch we've been showing you between 14th Street and up to 34th Street. While there are still affordable places to eat and good shopping bargains here, residential rents have gone up, now slightly above the Manhattan average, because it's a desirable neighborhood to live. Cafe R is a large hot food buffet that's a decent place for a quick and relatively inexpensive lunch or a meal anytime. They never close. It's an international food court and makes another reason for you to explore 32nd Street. Or how about a merchandise store where you can find a wide variety of stuff for $1? Like this bin of socks. You can see that New York does not have to be an expensive place to visit, especially down here in Midtown South. In addition to walking along 32nd Street, if you like this kind of nitty-gritty urban life, then you might also walk along 31st Street and 33rd Street, 30th Street. All of these parallel streets in the lower 30s are quite similar and fascinating. That cluster of trees is Greeley Square between 32nd and 33rd Street at 6th Avenue and Broadway. You really might be surprised to see in New York City so many little parks, so many pedestrian malls, and little oases of tranquility in the midst of this really busy city. But they've done a great job in New York. They closed off a lot of lanes to traffic and put out cafe tables and made it a really comfortable place to live and work. 20 years ago, these spaces were just neglected and wasted, but now they're taking full advantage of this prime real estate and turning it into a park in the middle of the city. You can always find delis and buffets to get a reasonably priced meal, and it's pretty tasty and fresh. Walk another block east on 33rd Street over to 5th Avenue. An example of the amazing new condominium high-rise construction that's going on in this Midtown area. It's really being revitalized. It's a lot of fun continuing east along 33rd, and you're going to run into some very inexpensive foods. Look at this, 2 eggs on a roll for $1. Wow. Or a big sandwich for $5 or $6, and these guys are open 24 hours. Cheese dog, fish sandwich, corn dog, cheese fries, but no papayas. You'll find all kinds of inexpensive places to eat in Midtown South. The #1 iconic building of New York, the Empire State Building, 102 stories. Completed in 1931, it was the tallest building in the world until 1970. Continuing east to Madison, where you'll see some very upscale residential condos with rooftop terraces. This is strictly for the multimillionaires. Back at ground level, we're returning west along 34th Street, heading towards Macy's and Herald Square at the corner of 34th and Broadway. Macy's has been at this location since 1902, where it now occupies a full city block with 10 floors and over 2 million square feet of sales area. The block of Broadway in front of it has been closed off to automobile traffic and transformed into a pedestrian mall. And there's a convenient subway station on the corner with 2 major lines running through it. This neighborhood along 34th Street is one of the busiest retail sections of the city, with Macy's serving as a big anchor to lure the shoppers in. Until now, the movie has stayed between 14th Street and 34th Street, that area of Midtown South. But for a minute, let's go north to 35th and 36th and have a look at how Broadway has been enhanced by more pedestrian zones. The city closed off 2 lanes of traffic and made open space for people to sit at tables and chairs, and this goes all the way up to Times Square. It's an amazing transformation. They've only left 1 lane for automobiles. There's even a farmer's market in what had been a couple of lanes of busy Broadway traffic. It brings a refreshing kind of a rural vibe to these blocks, with tons of fresh produce and baked goods and fruits, and you can also buy sandwiches and other prepared foods to sit down and eat lunch right on the spot, and do a little outdoor shopping for clothing while you're at it. Of course, there are many retail shops along the streets in this part of busy Midtown. Wandering a little further east on 36th Street, you'll soon come to the Morgan Library and Museum at the corner of Madison. They usually have excellent special exhibits happening. It's worth taking a look. The Morgan also has a small permanent collection and beautiful rooms that you can walk through. It would be worthwhile alone just to go see Mr. Morgan's library. Originally the private mansion of J.P. Morgan, it's been expanded and modernized into this lovely museum that's open to the public. We have a separate movie about the museums of New York, and you'll find that art is all around you as you walk through the streets of the city. Maybe it's a young art student doing a project sitting down on the sidewalk. Just be careful where you sit. It's a place that's always under construction and renovation. The city is constantly reinventing itself. Notice how nonchalant the people on the sidewalk are as this stack of lumber is carefully threaded through them. New skyscrapers have gotten taller and skinnier in recent years. There are nearly 2,000 coffee shops throughout New York City, with a big concentration here in Midtown. You're also going to find a lot of camera shops here in Midtown that look professional. They seem to have a big inventory and a good variety. Prices are posted, but not the best place to buy camera gear. Instead, you can go to B&H, probably the largest and best camera shop in the world. and my personal favorite store. Perhaps you've seen their website, which is a great place to buy audio, video, camera gear, but there's nothing like being here in the actual shop itself. It's quite a thrill for a techno geek to be surrounded by such a big variety of high-quality items with knowledgeable salespeople. Located just west of Madison Square Garden at 9th Avenue between 33rd and 34th Street. You're going to see these sales guys on nearly every corner selling tickets for the open-top bus, which is a good way to have a 3-hour tour of the city. The Hotel Pennsylvania, across from Madison Square Garden, is a well-known budget hotel. It's 100 years old, and when it first opened, it was the largest hotel in the world. It's still huge, with nearly 1,700 rooms, recently renovated. If you're going to Boston or Washington, there are some very cheap bus rides that you can get. For example, $20 one way or sometimes $30. There's about 10 different companies that offer this kind of service. Just Google it and book online. They have different pickup points throughout the city. This one is near Penn Station. Located in the same building as Madison Square Garden, Penn Station is a phenomenally busy place, with about 600,000 passengers a day, making it the busiest passenger transportation hub in the Western Hemisphere. While several subway lines go through Penn Station, the main rail traffic is to the suburbs and intercity, operated by Amtrak and the Long Island Railroad. Most of the people you'll see in the next few minutes are commuters just heading home, probably on a 1-hour train ride out to the suburbs. It's what you might call rush hour. Penn Station has 21 tracks and is at the center of the Amtrak Northeast Corridor, with lines connecting to Boston, Philadelphia, and Washington. But most of these people are heading out to the suburbs on Long Island and New Jersey. The tracks and station are running at full capacity, so there are plans for expansion. They're going to have a new Penn Station across the street in the former post office building, and they'll eventually be doubling the number of tracks. Life for the New York worker who commutes home every day out to the suburbs is quite a bit different than the typical tourist experience in New York. Visitors have that luxury of staying put in Midtown or some nice hotel that's centrally located and don't have to worry about fighting these crowds at rush hour. If you ever thought that living in New York would be a glamorous and exciting life, consider this. Perhaps it's pretty difficult. Rents in Manhattan are among the world's highest, so you would probably be commuting out to the suburbs like this every day. However, you might be using Penn Station on arrival or departure from New York. Just try and avoid this rush hour crowd if you can. There's direct service out to Newark Airport, or perhaps you're arriving by train from Boston or Philadelphia or Washington, so you just might be coming through Penn Station yourself. Another option to consider if you have a long layover at Newark Airport, let's say, or 10 hours between planes, you could take the train in from Newark Airport to Penn Station. It just takes about a half an hour, and walk around in Midtown for a few hours, then easily take the train back out to the airport to catch your flight. Or if you want to enjoy some people watching, just stand here at the corner of 7th Avenue and 33rd Street at the afternoon rush hour from 4 o'clock till 6 o'clock. You'll see lots of New Yorkers streaming by. That completes our look at Midtown South, the area between 14th Street and 34th Street. As you've seen, it's a part of the city that's not heavily visited by tourists, but it would certainly be worth your while. We're going to take a walk through the financial district at the southern tip of Manhattan, visiting the New World Trade Center and going up the tallest building in the Western Hemisphere and into the Memorial Museum. Starting out at the oldest park in New York City, Bowling Green, which opened in 1733, and the Grand Customs House behind it in the Beaux-Arts style. A left turn on Broad Street into the canyons of the financial district with the New York Stock Exchange. Originally founded in 1792, Across the street is Federal Hall that was built in the 1830s on the site of America's first Capitol building, and the statue of George Washington out front marks the spot where he was sworn in as our first president. Around the corner you'll find Trinity Church, built in 1846 in the neo-Gothic style with a tall steeple. Alexander Hamilton and other notables are buried here. It's the oldest neighborhood of the city, so you'll find some narrow alleys. And this is where Broadway begins. The Wall Street Bull has become one of the most popular statues to photograph in New York. It's an iconic symbol of the aggressiveness and power of Wall Street. The sculptor is Arturo Di Monica, who made the bull with his own money, $360,000, and without permission installed it in the site. It was an act of guerrilla art. At first it was impounded and taken away, but by popular demand it's here to stay. The Fearless Girl statue was created by a different artist and added later. Isamu Noguchi's Red Cube on Broadway sits right across the street from Zuccotti Park, which was the site of the Occupy Wall Street movement. Walking along Liberty Street, passing Italy, a major food market, soon brings us to one of the most unusual buildings in New York. It's the Oculus. This vast soaring space has been compared to a cathedral or being inside a whale or big dinosaur bones, but whatever it is, it's astonishing and inspiring. This is the most significant public building constructed in Manhattan in several decades. It's a train station and a shopping mall and a public gathering place, representing a kind of postmodern architecture as sculpture. It took twice as long and cost twice as much as expected to build it, over 10 years and $4 billion for the Oculus and the transportation hub that goes with it. And so it has been criticized by many people, including some who call it sterile and empty and loaded with overpriced high-end shops. But it has become a popular tourist attraction. It's a destination in itself, of course, being right next to the new Trade Center, and the museum brings in the crowds automatically, and those who come do seem to be impressed. This space is Instagram ready, highly photogenic. No matter where you point your camera, you'll get an interesting shot, although it helps to have a wide-angle lens. The functional purpose of the Oculus is to provide a train station for the commuter line from New Jersey, the PATH trains, with connections into the New York City subway system. It also provides an underground connection to One World Trade Center through this long hallway, which has been called the most expensive hallway in the world, estimated cost of about $200 million. From the outside, the building is equally impressive with those long ribs that reach up to 160 feet high, intended to look like a big bird taking off, a kind of phoenix rising from the ashes. Next door, you'll find the September 11th Memorial Fountains on the site of the original World Trade Towers. And beneath these fountains is the National September 11th Memorial and Museum, which you'll find to be one of the most somber and profound experiences of your New York visit. Upon entry, you look down into a large space where the slurry wall still stands on the left side, and in the center is the last column standing from the ruins. The slurry wall had kept groundwater away from the tower's foundations, and somehow it survived. Many visitors experience intense feelings of sorrow. While the museum honestly documents and preserves the history of this painful event, it is designed to promote healing. It gives you a chance to honor the victims and pay your respects. This deceptively large museum enables you to walk all the way around the perimeters of both towers. Volunteer guides describe some of the exhibits.
It is the largest loss of life for the department responding to a single event. The damage that you see to the front cab of the vehicle was a direct result of the collapse of the North Tower.
Although usually busy, the crowd remains eerily quiet out of respect. Opens at 9 a.m. every day. Be a good idea to get there just before opening. From the plaza, you can't miss the tallest building in the Americas, One World Trade. And you enter in, follow the signs, up the escalators to the lobby. We visited on a January weekday afternoon, so it was amazingly uncrowded. The elevator takes you up 100 floors in 47 seconds with what looks like a view, but actually it's a very clever video screen all around you as you go up, a prelude of the real thing.
Welcome to One World Observatory.
The observation platform is wonderfully designed with the dark floor and ceiling and vast picture windows to give you the view. Especially nice on a day when the weather is clear and the facility was not very crowded. Easy to get right up to the window and gaze out all you want in all directions. The main vista is looking down at Lower Manhattan, Tribeca, the Village, and then up to the band of skyscrapers at Midtown. You can easily walk all the way around the building, especially on a day like this when it's not crowded. It's so easy, and you can stop at the various windows, looking out the east side, the south side, and it's fun to watch the other visitors taking their pictures too. And you can see the Statue of Liberty. The city municipal building, circled in red, looking down, looks pretty small, but it's 40 stories high and holds 2,000 workers, including my father in the 1960s. In the distance, you can make out the Empire State Building, which also has an excellent observation deck. There's another lookout terrace at Rockefeller Center on top of the RCA building, where you're standing in the middle of the skyscrapers of Midtown. That's really excellent too. There's a large gift shop, of course, with related souvenirs. There's a snack shop, a restaurant, and a bar. The information talk is worth listening to, and you can sit down.
We have the East River on this side, the Hudson's on the other, and in between the two, well, here we are on the island of Manhattan. Probably the coolest island there is. Now, some of you out there might be wondering about this big, beautiful area over here on the other side of the Hudson River. Now, it's not part of the city. It's not even part of the state. That is New Jersey out there, and let me tell you, it is a beautiful place.
They also share practical tips on sightseeing and nearby dining. Visitors spend an average of about a half an hour up top, 1,200 feet above the city, and then it's a lot quicker getting down than it was going up. You'll go down escalators, back down the elevator, and you're back at street level before you know it. Returning to the plaza, you'll pass by the memorial pools again, and you could go back into the Oculus to the subway lines to continue your journey. And we have more movies about New York that you can find in our collection.